Hi, my name's Scott the Miniature Maniac, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. What up, Mini family? In this video, we're going to try to mash together a lot of different things. One, we're going to review this Arteza paint line and also Arteza brushes they sent along to me. We're going to be trying to do a video without writing a script, so kind of in a more freestyle way. And we're also going to be trying to paint with only a few colors, so a limited palette to see how well we can mix and figure it out without having to go and buy a bunch of paints. Sorry for the interruption. One quick announcement: if you want to buy a sweater like the one that I'm wearing in this video, or a t-shirt like this that says Paint More Minis, my store is finally open, and it's open at miniac.bigcartel.com. I'm selling things like cutting mats, sweaters, t-shirts, patches, and cups, and everything, you name it. It's all limited edition, so if you want it, you got to get it now. All of the clothing is pre-order, and it'll be available to pre-order for a month, and then you'll never be able to get it again. Additionally, if you buy 2 items and use the coupon code Miniac2, you can get 10% off. If you buy 3 items and use the coupon code Miniac3, you can get 20% off. All right, that's all for now. Back to the video. As a quick ethics statement, Arteza sent me all of this product for free to review, but are in no way modifying my opinion of the product or how I am reviewing it. We're going to be painting a miniature for a character in my D&D group, a Frost Elf, and this is a model from Dark Sword Miniatures, and let's get cracking with a little bit of cleanup. There can be a temptation to want to polish pewter miniatures either with high grit sandpaper or steel wool, but the reality is that after several layers of paint and also primer, you are not going to notice any difference from doing that. So I would suggest just skipping that and just worrying about things like mold lines and flash attached to the model. Now, to adhere this miniature to the plinth, we're just going to use some double-sided tape and a piece of wood that I use as a handle for the majority of my miniature projects. We're also going to use an airbrush to prime this miniature, and we're using my Sotar to prime, and this is probably not the airbrush that you want to be using to prime stuff, but it's the only one that I have right now, and let's just see if it works. Well, that seemed to work just fine with the Sotar, but it might have been more of an issue if I was priming more miniatures, but because I only did one, it wasn't that big of a problem. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to painting like I did in my speed painting video, where I start with an undercoat for this miniature that is really blue. And the reason why I want to do something that's really blue, or why I think I want to do something that's really blue, is because this is a Frost Elf, and so I want to give her a super cold feel, a cold ambiance. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a blue undercoat to hopefully assist with that ambiance. Something I want to draw your attention to while I'm undercoating this model with white primer is that when I come to the cloak has a lot of vertical running details, so I want to prime that horizontally to catch all those details, which is different than how I am priming the rest of the miniature, which is top down vertically. So when it comes to cloaks, that particular area, you want to, in order to take advantage of the Zenith undercoat, you want to prime it horizontally or perpendicular to the details, so you catch all those nice details and you have a nice shadow running along each kind of curl of the robe. One thing I'll say before even painting with these at all is that I'm pretty sure that these are going to be really glossy and bad paints because they're just so cheap. And if they are so cheap, I would imagine that they're not going to be quality. It's just a matter of price. Now, the first actual observation I have is that the label on the bottle versus the image on the box is wildly different in terms of what the color is. I'm not sure if it's the one on the back of the box or it's the one on the label. Vermilion red is not typically this orange, but let's see what happens. The 5 colors I am going to use, or the 6 rather, are ultramarine blue, mid yellow, Mars brown, vermilion red, Mars black, and titanium white. And these are the only colors that I'll use for the entire mini, and I'll stick to just these ones. I hate to say I told you so, but these paints are exactly what I expected them to be. They're exactly like the paints that I did in my really cheap challenge, spending as little money as humanly possible. They're glossy, they have terrible coverage, they dry instantaneously, so if you have brush strokes, it's almost impossible to try to clean them up. But yeah, it's just not a very enjoyable experience using these paints. I don't want to sugarcoat it at all. Maybe the only positive thing is that they come in tubes, so you don't have to mix them whenever you want to use them. They're already mixed. And 2, you get a buttload of paints for super cheap. In addition to that, I was trying to make a purple. Mixing a red and a blue resulted in quite a dark and desaturated purple. Despite the blue and the red being quite saturated colors, for some reason when you mix them together, it just kills it all of a sudden. I'm not sure why that's happening. If that's normal for tube paints, or actually even just normal paints. But yeah, I'm not sure why that's happening either. Now, I've applied a few layers of purple at this point, and again, just no coverage whatsoever. This is a really unenjoyable experience, and I don't want to continue using this paint, just based on these 5 colors that I've used so far. So I think what I want to do is I want to get some context here. I've never used tube paints before that weren't super cheap, and so I just want to get some better tube paints to see what the experience is going to be like if I have something that is supposedly higher quality. So let's go get some. So I hopped in the car and I brought my whole family with me. Crushy. I went to my favorite art supply store in town. It's called Blick. And when I opened the doors, I was just completely inundated with options for tube paints from all kinds of different brands. Also, who knew this existed? So I'm back from the art store. It's a few days later, and I picked up some Liquitex heavy-bodied paint. I did some experimentations with it, and what I found is that it's a little bit satin and not as glossy as the original stuff. It feels a lot better when I handle it with the brush, but the purple that I mix is still a little bit crappy, and at least I know why now. When I bought my blue paint, it is a green based shade, and when you mix purple, you mix the blue and the red, and the green inside of my blue is counteracting with my red, resulting to a really muddy looking purple. It's not very good at all. So this could have been the reason why the blue paint wasn't working so well from the other paint range. It was a green based shade, and it didn't just list that. What was a little bit confusing is that I figured if it's a green based shade, it would make a really nice pretty green color, but when I mix the green with the yellow, it's still kind of a desaturated green. It isn't very vibrant, and I kind of expected it to be vibrant, and then unfortunately it's not. So I don't know why that's the case, but maybe this is a limitation of using a limited wet palette, or maybe it's still the paints, but I don't know. We'll continue the miniature with these paints, and we'll see what happens. I'm also going to mix some glaze medium into each of these paints instead of water. What I understand about glaze medium as opposed to water is that it has acrylic binder in it, and it won't cause the paint to split as much as just using normal water. And I'm not going to use a lot, just 1 drop for like each of these piles of paint. Just right off the bat, this paint is so much creamier than normal miniature paint. It's like the consistency is like almost like butter, like really melted butter. I also need to make sure I'm getting all the paint out of my paint bristles. For the initial brown, I mixed a lot of red and equal parts black, and then put in a little bit of blue to get this brown. And then to adjust the brown and modulate it to make it a little bit more interesting, because there are quite a few other parts, I added a little bit of black to get some darker brown. And then to get kind of more of a tanner brown, I added some yellow to get a little bit more of that. And then to get the color of the pants,
I took white and yellow and added them together, and that was a little bit too warm, and so then I added a tiny bit of my purple that I've mixed up into it, and it made this really interesting gray color that I like quite a bit. And then for the quiver on the back, just to kind of go along with the blue themes here, I took a tiny bit of blue and added it into this color to get more of the cold kind of white khaki color that we have going on. Another thing I just thought of is that when canvas painters typically paint on a canvas, they don't tend to care so much about smoothness as much as miniature painters do. And so they don't tend to maybe thin their paints as much as miniature painters do. So what I'm going to try to do with this heavy-bodied acrylic paint is to not thin it as much as I normally would, and maybe just work with the texture of the paint, which is not something that's very normal for miniature painting. I also want to mention that I originally did pick up golden paints, and one of my friends told me, who's done a lot of experimentation with artist acrylic grade heavy body paints, is that golden tends to dry very glossy, and so I decided to go for Liquitex, which is a different brand, to see if it was more satin, and luckily it was. So shout out to you, Kenny Hibbs, you know who you are. And now everyone else on the internet knows who you are. I also want to say that it's so refreshing to paint a model that doesn't have a buttload of details on it. I'm also at the same time painting a Space Marine for a commission, and it's just burdened with details, and it's like, it makes the painting process so much less enjoyable, because the things you actually care about to paint are the large details, the large features. And while it definitely adds a lot of character to a model to have details, having to paint many of them makes it such a pain and such a drag. So there is definitely a balance to the right amount of detail and the wrong amount of detail. And I want to say that painting this Darkstorm miniature is such a nice refreshing break from painting this stupid Space Marine. I painted the sleeves of the miniature, and I gotta say the coverage on this paint is not good compared to the miniature paints. It's not good at all. I did instinctively add a little bit of water to the paint, and maybe I should just not thin it at all and just use it right out of the tube. So I guess I'll continue on other parts of the miniature now with the other paint that I try my very best not to add any moisture to, because I think it might just ruin the paint coverage. I'm not entirely sure, but let's keep going on and we'll figure it out. Now to mix my skin tone, I don't entirely know how to do it, but I'm gonna guess a little bit. I think you want to start with an orange color, so we'll take some red and some yellow. This is not enough paint. More red and more yellow. You want to make an orange, and this actually makes a nice orange. This is pretty good. And then I think from here, you probably want to add in some white. That's starting to look pretty good. No, you don't want this to look like Trump, so let's add a tiny bit of blue. And that looks green. Okay. Maybe a little bit more white. You can see I'm doing this in stages too, so that if I, oh hey, that looks good. If I mess up, I can kind of almost backtrack, kind of edit, undo, but not entirely. But a little bit more white, and that kind of looks good. And maybe we'll take some of our brown that we mixed up, which is just like a lot of red and black, just tiny, and just kind of maybe make like a shade color. I don't know. So this is a pretty good palette actually to work with. I think I'll use these two last colors predominantly. I kind of ran out of paint here at the end, so I'm gonna have to stretch this paint quite a bit. But this is a good color progression that we can work with. I feel a little bit bad about totally dismissing the other set of paint, so we're gonna go back to it with the same things that we learned on this set of paint and just see if we can work with it and see if it works any better if we don't thin it as much as we did in the past. You know, now that I've used this Arteza paint and my frame of mind is correct in that I know how other heavy-bodied acrylics work, I will say this Arteza paint, while it is glossy, is pretty much on par for what you would expect for artist acrylic paint that is this price. The value of this paint compared to normal artist acrylic grade heavy bodied paint, I'm gonna stop saying that because that's a lot of words to say. The quality is pretty much exactly where you expected, if not quite higher. I would call this the bones of tube paint, essentially, if I'm making that kind of analogy. It works, it's high in value, but it's a little bit glossy, and it doesn't cover as well as the good stuff. But when you use it right, which is pretty much probably right out of the tube with very minimal thinning, the coverage is pretty much right up there with the other guys. It's just a little bit more glossy than other brands, and doesn't cover exactly as well. We've pretty much got all the base coats where I think I want them. They're not fully opaque, but as I apply more layers of colors and add additional highlights, the opaqueness won't really matter a whole lot. But what I want to try first before moving on is washing with this color by just adding a bunch of water to it, and just water. We're gonna see if we can bring this cloak down a little bit to more of a blue in the crevices by just taking some of the blue from Arteza, adding a lot of water to it, and then washing it and seeing what happens. I gotta say that I'm pleasantly surprised at how amazing this washing technique worked. Now, I think there's probably one crucial reason why it's working so well, and that's because of the glossy finish that the paint left. Because of the glossy finish, the paint wash is having a much easier time breaking the surface tension and being able to collect in the recesses as opposed to elsewhere. You know, for the longest time I was scared that using water with a wash would result in kind of a stainy, gross look, but maybe the gloss varnish is the key. Maybe it's always worked all along, but I'm very pleasantly surprised. This exceeded my expectations a lot. Let's see what it looks like when it dries though, if it changes at all. So with the wash, after it's dry, we can see there are some areas where there were some water stains that occur, but this isn't anything that we can't fix up with a little bit of additional layers that we are going to apply. So this is how I'm going to approach the rest of the model. For the purple parts, I'm going to assume that the color I painted was the darkest area, and everything beyond this is going to be just highlights. And then for everything else, I'm going to build up the highlights, mixing in whites and tiny bits of yellow, and kind of just using the same methodology that I used in my speed painting video, is that I want to build up the highlights closest to the face. The brightest parts of the model are toward the head and shoulders and the face, and that's where your attention is drawn to. So without further ado, let's get cracking. What I'm getting with this paint is an almost rub and buff like quality. It's almost waxy in nature, and what that allows me to do is put the paint down and kind of smudge it around until I get a decent blend. It's more like what I imagine an oil paint to be, where you have longer working time and you can get a nicer blend because of that longer working time. But I'm not using any of my typical blending tricks that I might do with miniature paints, like wet blending and feathering things out with a clean brush. But I'm seriously just putting paint on and wiping it, and it seems to be blending a lot easier than I would anticipate it to blend. So that's a positive thing that we're finding out now. These brushes are starting to fall apart a little bit when it comes to highlighting because they don't form that neat of a tip. But for everything else, these brushes have been working just fine. This is enough painting for this model. We're at about 5 hours, and now we're just gonna base it in a nice wintry theme, and then I'll call it done and then give our final evaluation of this paint range and these paint brushes. Since this is a frost elf, I wanted to put her in kind of more of a frosty scenery, so I painted the base with blues and grays and dry brushed it white. And then also did some snow. And now I've never done snow before, so I looked into how to do snow in the best way, and the best resource that I know for snow, and also for a lot of things, is Massive Voodoo. What Roman Lapat uses for snow is very specifically baking powder and not baking soda. What I've understood about the difference is that baking soda has a tendency to yellow over time, and baking powder does it.
Do I know if that's true or not? I have no idea, but I'll guess I'll find out. But I'll say that when you mix a little bit of matte medium and water into the baking powder, like Roman suggests in his guides, which are linked below if you'd like to go and find them, you do get this nice snowball chunky effect. It doesn't just look like a white powdery sand. It actually looks like it's a nice snow. I also tossed some shrubs on there and painted the tips white and added some snow to them to kind of make it look like they had been frozen by the climate. After that, I polished off the base rim with some black paint. I love that stark, sharp baseline. And I also hit it with a can of matte varnish just to knock down some of that kind of higher satin finish that the paint had. Something that I liked about painting with this style of paint, both the Liquitex and Arteza, was what I mentioned earlier. It had that kind of almost waxy property to it where once I put the paint down fully undiluted, I could smear it around and mix it and blend it almost effortlessly. I don't know what it is about miniature paint, but I don't get that same kind of thing. And if I try to paint with paint that's totally undiluted, I definitely don't get as smooth a finish as if I were to use this kind of paint. So this is kind of something that I'm going to maybe look into a little bit more, maybe use some more of this style of paint in my palette as opposed to brands like Citadel and Scale 75 and P3, but it's got me excited, so I'm going to look into this more, definitely, for sure. So what do I think about the Arteza paints and paint brushes? Well, first of all, the synthetic brushes are pretty much exactly what I thought they would be. They're very similar to the brushes that I bought for my cheap miniature painting challenge, but I mean there's 15 of them and you get them for $14.54. So are they meant for accurate painting? No, probably not. But a lot of what miniature painters do, a lot of the big parts in the beginning with laying down base coats and getting initial blends, doesn't necessarily need accuracy and can be achieved with some kind of cruddier brushes. I can really see myself spending $14 and getting a lot of brushes that I would use for base coating and then keeping my nicer brushes for more specific applications. Like 15 of these brushes cost basically as much as one of my Raphael 8 404s. And I'm sure that 15 of these brushes may possibly last longer than one of them. It's hard to say, but there's definitely a value there in terms of sheer quantity of tools if you wanted just to burn through them and use them for just really heavy tasks. I will say that I misjudged it at first. I took artist acrylic grade paint and I tried to fit it into the box of miniature painting, the style of miniature painting. And then when I compared it to another brand that I was familiar with, I noticed that what I was doing was using the tool incorrectly. I think when it comes to paints like this, you really don't want to thin them down too much, and applying them straight out of the tube didn't really lead to me having a bunch of brush strokes or messed up areas on the miniature itself. So once I kind of figured that out, then I realized these kind of work just like my normal stuff. I just need to operate with them a little bit differently. And sure, they do dry a little bit more glossy, but when it comes to price, you're getting 62 paints for $39.99. That there is no miniature painting brand that compares to that in terms of quantity. So if you're looking for a lot of paints and maybe looking to dip your toes into the world of tube paints, this is a really cheap way to do that, and also just get like a wild variety of colors. Something that's also pretty cool about this type of tube paint is that it has pigment designations on it. So a paint will say what it is composed of. And that's a standard across the industry. If I want to go look up PB15 or PW6, I know with some confidence that that pigment is the same pigment being used in another brand that lists PB15 or PW6. Now, the quality of pigment can differ between the two brands, but possibly the shade or the actual color hue itself will be the same. If you're interested in purchasing some of the Arteza products, you can find an affiliate link in the description below. When you buy products through this link, I get a kickback through Arteza. As to my limited paint palette experimentation, I will say that a lot of my secondary colors that I achieved were pretty desaturated. And I thought this was related to the quality of pigmentation, but I went and bought paints that were significantly more expensive and achieved pretty similar results. The orange was pretty good, but the green and the purple were pretty lackluster. So I'm interested in this idea of using a limited paint palette, and maybe that limited paint palette should extend to also using colors like the secondaries, like buying orange, buying green, and also buying purple, and going for something more like 9 or 10 paints instead of 5 or 6. I'm not entirely sure, but definitely expect me to experiment with this in the future. I'm curious if one can achieve a simple paint palette and get really nice, vibrant, punchy colors. What did you guys think of this video style where it's unscripted and it's off the cuff and I'm showing my raw approach to painting miniatures? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know in the comment section below, and one person will get a 60 paint set of Arteza paints. I'll pick the winner and I'll send you it, and I'll contact you to get your address and everything. But let me know what you thought of the video style in the comment section below, and you could possibly win a whole bunch of paints to try out for yourself. Thanks for checking out my kind of little bit different video, guys. I really appreciate it. And also letting me know what you think of it. If you want to support the channel, I have a Patreon account with a bunch of fun rewards. I sell t-shirts and stickers on my Redbubble account. Both those items linked in the description below. But more importantly than that, don't forget to paint more minis!